Hey guys, our devotion today comes from Matthew chapter 7. We're finishing up the Sermon on the Mount today. Before we look at it, let's remember we were praying for Arnold and Sheila Keyser. So much of these last few chapters, what has stood out to me is Jesus' teaching on what righteousness looks like, on what a life that is pleasing to God looks like. And I think we look at this as followers, as those who have the Holy Spirit in us, and we see what does God in this chapter, and it's the same thing. There's tons of teaching in here. I think for my part, what I really want to look at today and what stood out to me is how Christ begins to wrap up this huge passage that we've been through, the Sermon on the Mount. He begins by making some pretty startling statements in verse 21, and that's where I wanted to start to look at today. I think that this statement that he makes in verse 21 is something that, it's reason enough to give any of us pause to maybe do a little bit of self-examination when we read through this and we take Christ's words seriously, especially for someone who doesn't really know the Lord. Maybe we're just a religious person. It's meant to shake us a little bit, to open our eyes. And I think that's the reason why Jesus shares this passage. I'm going to go ahead and read it. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." That right off the bat there, that's a pretty strong statement. Who is going to be about ready to enter the kingdom of heaven and call out, "Lord, Lord"? Those people who claim to believe in him. He's not talking about atheists here. He's talking about people that would call themselves Christians or followers of Christ. Lord, Lord. He says not everybody who says that will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So he's drawing this contrast here between the person who's, it's all talk. They're calling out for the Lord, but they haven't done. Goes on, he says, "On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?'" These religious people begin to list off, pretty impressive sounding list of that they feel qualifies them to enter into the kingdom of heaven, and shows proof that, they're sincere when they say, "Lord, Lord." But it's not fooling Christ, because he said, you say to me, "Lord, Lord," but you haven't done my Father. And I think we see that contrast there. They've been doing something. Anybody might look at their lives and say, "Man, look what a good person that was. Look at all the good things that they did, and wow, they're a very spiritual person." Christ looks at that same person and says, "Yeah, but you weren't doing the will of my Father." Whose will were they doing? Doesn't matter. It wasn't the will of God that they were doing. He wraps up and he says, "And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers.'" I think it's pretty incredible that Jesus is wrapping up this teaching, this Sermon on the Mount. So much of what he's been talking about is law. To live a life that's pleasing to God, what his will looks like. And then here at the end, he says, "Do you know God? Do I know you?" There's a difference between living a religious life and knowing God and doing his will because you know him. If you don't know him, you can't do his will. You can live a very religious life, but it's not the same thing. And I think what Christ is doing here is he's drawing their attention to that. Don't be confused by what I'm teaching you here. I'm not teaching you to be religious. I'm God and do his will. Don't just go off and try to be a good person. Don't just go off and try to be a religious person, a person who's going to be in church and get the word and all that. Those are good things, but I want you to know God. Christ wraps up this teaching by giving that excellent, obviously, illustration of the man who builds his house on the sand, the man who builds his house on the rock. And when the storms come, obviously the one whose house was built on the rock is the one, and this is a comparison here, the person who hears Christ's words and who is obedient to them, who does them. He's the one who builds. We have to come to Christ as he is. We can't pick and choose what we wanted to hear. That's religion. We can't do things our way and meet him on our own terms. He says, listen to what I've taught you. Accept it. Obey it. React to it. Let it change you. Don't try to change it. And you will be building your house on the rock. I am thankful for this passage today. If God spoke something to you today out of this, leave us a message. Let's minister to one another.